The morning sun cast long shadows across Ouagadougou International Airport as Captain Ibrahim Traore finished his usual security briefing with airport officials. As Burkina Faso's youngest leader, the 34-year-old had transformed the nation's approach to foreign relations, particularly with former colonial powers. His anti-corruption stance and fierce independence had already rattled many diplomatic circles across West Africa. Traore had risen to power through a military coup in September 2022, but unlike many military leaders, he had genuine popular support. The people saw him as their protector against foreign exploitation, especially from France, which had maintained economic control over Burkina Faso's resources for decades. His government had been working tirelessly to expose corruption networks that involved both local officials and foreign diplomats. On this particular Tuesday morning, Traore received an urgent call from Colonel Sawadogo, his trusted security chief. Intelligence reports suggested that a high-ranking French diplomat would be leaving the country that day, and there were suspicious circumstances surrounding his departure. The diplomat, Ambassador François Dubois, had been in Burkina Faso for 3 years, officially working on development projects, but Traore's intelligence network had been monitoring unusual activities. The young leader had learned not to trust diplomatic immunity as a shield for criminal activities. Too many resources had been smuggled out of African nations under the protection of diplomatic pouches and official status. Traore had made it clear to his security forces that no one, regardless of their diplomatic status, was above the law when it came to protecting Burkina Faso's national resources. As Traore drove to the airport with his security detail, he reflected on the mounting evidence against Ambassador Dubois. Bank records showed unusual transactions, and several mining officials had reported pressure from French representatives to approve questionable export licenses. The gold mines in Burkina Faso were among the richest in West Africa, and Traore suspected that much of the wealth was being siphoned off through corrupt deals. The airport buzzed with its usual activity as Traore arrived. Passengers lined up at check-in counters, and the departure lounge filled with travelers heading to various African cities and European capitals. Airport security had been quietly increased, though most passengers remained unaware of the operation about to unfold. Traore positioned himself strategically where he could observe the VIP departure area typically used by diplomats and government officials. Ambassador Dubois appeared exactly as intelligence had predicted, accompanied by 2 French security personnel, and carrying what appeared to be standard diplomatic luggage. The 58-year-old diplomat moved with confidence, clearly expecting the usual courtesies extended to diplomatic personnel. He had probably made this journey dozens of times before, secure in the knowledge that diplomatic immunity would protect him from any serious scrutiny. Traore watched as Dubois approached the departure gate, noting the diplomat's body language and the way his security detail positioned themselves. Something about their formation suggested they were protecting more than just a person. They were guarding something valuable. The young leader's instincts, honed through years of military service and intelligence work, told him that today would be different from Ambassador Dubois's previous departures. The moment had arrived for Traore to make a decision that would send shockwaves through diplomatic circles across Africa and Europe. He had built his reputation on fearless action against corruption, and today would test whether he was willing to challenge even the most powerful foreign interests. The airport's security systems were in place, his trusted team was ready, and the evidence pointed toward a significant breach of Burkina Faso's sovereignty. As Ambassador Dubois handed his diplomatic passport to airport officials, Traore stepped forward, his presidential guard flanking him on both sides. The bustling airport seemed to slow down as the young leader approached the departure area, his presence immediately recognized by airport staff and passengers alike. This was no routine presidential visit to the airport. This was the beginning of a confrontation that would define Burkina Faso's independence from foreign interference. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between Africa's youngest leader and one of France's most senior diplomats, with Burkina Faso's gold reserves hanging in the balance. Ambassador Dubois froze as he recognized President Traore approaching the departure gate. The French diplomat had dealt with African leaders before, but Traore was different, unpredictable, and unafraid of confronting Western powers. Airport security immediately became tense as they realized their president was personally involving himself in what should have been a routine diplomatic departure. Ambassador Dubois, Traore called out in perfect French, his voice carrying across the departure lounge. I need to speak with you before your departure. The diplomatic protocol dictated that such requests should go through proper channels, but Traore had never been one to follow colonial-era protocols when protecting his nation's interests. Dubois straightened his tie and approached with a forced smile, his two security personnel staying close behind. Mr. President, what an unexpected pleasure. I trust everything is in order with my departure documents. The ambassador's voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed concern. He had received warnings from the French embassy about Traore's increasingly aggressive stance toward French interests in the region. Traore studied the diplomat carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way his security detail had positioned themselves near what appeared to be a specially reinforced diplomatic bag. Ambassador, my security services have raised some concerns about your luggage. I'm sure you understand that even diplomatic immunity has limits when it comes to protecting our national resources. The French security personnel immediately stepped forward, but Traore's presidential guard matched their movement, creating a tense standoff in the middle of the airport departure lounge. Other passengers began to notice the commotion, some recognizing their young president and wondering why he was personally confronting a foreign diplomat. Mr. President, I must protest, Dubois said, his diplomatic training kicking in. I am traveling under full diplomatic immunity, and any interference with my departure would constitute a serious violation of international law. The French government will not tolerate such treatment of its representatives. His tone had shifted from friendly to threatening, revealing the arrogance that Traore had come to despise in foreign officials. Traore smiled coldly, unmoved by the diplomatic threats. Ambassador, international law also prohibits the theft of natural resources from sovereign nations. I have reason to believe you are carrying items that belong to the people of Burkina Faso. He gestured to Colonel Sawadogo, who stepped forward with a metal detector and scanning equipment. The confrontation drew the attention of airport staff, passengers, and even international journalists who happened to be traveling that day. Phone cameras began recording as word spread that President Traore was personally conducting what appeared to be a search of a French diplomat. This was exactly the kind of bold action that had made Traore popular among his people, but enemies among foreign powers. Dubois' face reddened as he realized the situation was escalating beyond his control. This is absolutely outrageous. I demand to speak with your foreign minister immediately. France will not stand for this kind of treatment of its diplomatic personnel. There will be serious consequences for this action. His voice rose, attracting even more attention from onlookers. The only consequences I'm concerned about are for those who steal from my people, Traore replied calmly. Colonel Sawadogo, please begin the security screening. The colonel approached with his equipment and Dubois' security team moved to block him, but found themselves outnumbered by Traore's presidential guard. The metal detector immediately began beeping loudly as it passed over Dubois' diplomatic bag. The sound echoed through the departure lounge, and even the ambassador couldn't hide his shock at how quickly his carefully planned departure was unraveling. Passengers stopped to watch, many recording the unprecedented scene on their phones. There seems to be something very heavy in your bag, Ambassador, Traore observed, his voice steady despite the historic nature of what he was doing. No African leader had dared to search French diplomatic luggage in decades, and everyone present understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in Franco-African relations. Dubois tried one final diplomatic maneuver, pulling out his phone to call the French embassy. I'm calling Ambassador Laurent immediately. This situation requires immediate diplomatic intervention at the highest level. But Traore simply nodded to one of his guards, who politely but firmly took the phone from the diplomat's hands. The confrontation had reached its critical point, with dozens of witnesses and international implications hanging in the balance. The tension in the airport departure lounge reached a breaking point as Colonel Sawadogo prepared to open Ambassador Dubois' diplomatic bag. The French diplomat made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the situation, invoking every diplomatic protocol he could remember from his decades of service in African nations. "President Traore, you are making a terrible mistake," Dubois warned, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "The French Republic has invested millions in Burkina Faso's development. This action will destroy decades of cooperation between our nations." He gestured dramatically, trying to appeal to the growing crowd of onlookers and international passengers who were recording every moment. Traore remained unmoved by the diplomatic theatrics. "Ambassador, France has extracted billions from Burkina Faso's gold mines over those same decades. If your bag contains what I believe it does, then we'll see who has really been destroying cooperation between our nations." He nodded to Colonel Sawadogo, who carefully unzipped the reinforced diplomatic bag. The first items revealed were standard diplomatic documents and personal belongings, but as the colonel continued searching, he discovered a false bottom in the bag. His experienced hands quickly found the hidden mechanism, and with a soft click, the bottom panel opened to reveal something that made everyone in the immediate area gasp. Nestled in custom-fitted foam compartments were dozens of small gold bars, each stamped with the official seal of Burkina Faso's National Mining Authority. The gold gleamed under the airport's fluorescent lights, and the sight sent murmurs through the crowd of witnesses. Even Dubois' own security personnel looked shocked, suggesting they may not have been fully aware of what their diplomat was carrying. "My God," whispered one of the airport officials, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "Those are official gold reserves from our national treasury." The bars represented more than just precious metal. They were symbols of Burkina Faso's sovereignty and wealth that belonged to its people, not foreign diplomats. Ambassador Dubois' face went pale as he realized his careful smuggling operation had been completely exposed. Those are samples for geological analysis in Paris," he stammered, his diplomatic training abandoning him in the face of overwhelming evidence. "This is all perfectly legal under our bilateral mining agreements." Traore picked up one of the gold bars, feeling its weight and examining the official markings. "Ambassador, these bars are worth approximately 2 million euros. Since when do geological samples require such valuable specimens, and why were they hidden in a secret compartment?" His voice carried across the departure lounge, ensuring that everyone present understood the magnitude of what had been discovered. The crowd of witnesses grew larger as word spread throughout the airport. Passengers delayed their flights to watch the historic confrontation, and airport staff abandoned their posts to see their president personally exposing international corruption. Social media posts began spreading globally within minutes, with hashtags like Chang Traore Gold and Burkina Faso Justice trending across African Twitter. Colonel Sawadogo continued his search and discovered additional evidence that made the situation even more damaging for Dubois. Hidden alongside the gold bars were official documents bearing French government seals, detailed mining reports, and what appeared to be bank account information for offshore companies. The evidence suggested a sophisticated smuggling network that had been operating for years. "These documents show systematic theft of our national resources," Traore announced, holding up papers that clearly outlined the illegal mining operations. "Ambassador Dubois, you and your government have been stealing from the people of Burkina Faso while pretending to offer development assistance." His words echoed through the airport, and the crowd responded with a mix of anger and approval. Dubois made one final attempt to salvage the situation, appealing directly to Traore's political calculations. "President, think about what you're doing. France provides significant military support against terrorist threats in the region. This incident could jeopardize security cooperation that keeps your government in power." It was a thinly veiled threat that revealed the colonial mentality Traore had been fighting against. The young president's eyes hardened at the mention of military threats. "Ambassador, Burkina Faso's security depends on our economic independence, not on foreign military support that comes with strings attached. Today we begin securing our own future." He gestured to his security team, who began formally documenting the seized gold and documents. As airport security cordoned off the area and began processing the evidence, Traore faced the most crucial decision of the confrontation. He could still allow Dubois to leave quietly in exchange for private assurances, or he could take the unprecedented step of formally arresting a French diplomat on Burkinabe soil. The choice would define his presidency and Burkina Faso's relationship with the Western world. The decisive moment arrived as President Traore looked directly into Ambassador Dubois' eyes, seeing decades of colonial arrogance and exploitation reflected back at him. The French diplomat still believed his immunity and his nation's power would protect him, but he had severely underestimated the resolve of Africa's youngest leader. Ambassador François Dubois, Traore announced in a clear, authoritative voice that carried throughout the airport departure lounge, "By the power vested in me as President of Burkina Faso, I hereby place you under arrest for theft of national resources, smuggling, and conspiracy against the sovereignty of our nation." The words sent shockwaves through the crowd of witnesses and marked the first time in decades that an African leader had dared to arrest a European diplomat. Dubois' legs nearly gave out as the reality of his situation hit him. "You cannot do this. I have diplomatic immunity. The French embassy will have you removed from power within hours." His voice cracked with desperation as he realized that all his diplomatic protections were meaningless in the face of Traore's unwavering determination. The airport erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps from Burkinabe citizens who had gathered to witness the historic confrontation. Many had never seen a foreign official held accountable for crimes against their nation, and Traore's bold action represented a long-awaited moment of justice. International passengers looked on in amazement, many continuing to record the unprecedented scene. Colonel Sawadogo stepped forward with handcuffs, but Traore raised his hand to stop him. "Ambassador, I'm offering you a choice that your government has never offered my people. You can cooperate fully with our investigation, reveal the full extent of this smuggling network, and face justice through proper legal channels, or you can continue to hide behind diplomatic immunity while we expose everything publicly." French security personnel tried to move closer to their ambassador, but found themselves surrounded by Traore's presidential guard. The situation had evolved beyond a simple diplomatic incident into a test of wills between two nations, with vastly different levels of military power but equal legal authority within Burkina Faso's borders. "This is an act of war against France," Dubois shouted, his diplomatic composure completely shattered. "President Macron will never allow this insult to stand. You are destroying your own country's future for a moment of populist theater." His threats only served to demonstrate the colonial mentality that had kept African nations subservient for generations. Traore smiled calmly in the face of the diplomatic threats. "Ambassador, France declared economic war on Burkina Faso the day you began stealing our gold. Today we're simply defending ourselves." He gestured to the seized evidence, which airport officials were carefully cataloging under the watchful eyes of international witnesses. The young president then did something that no one expected. He pulled out his personal phone and began live streaming the arrest on social media. Within seconds, thousands of viewers from across Africa and the world were watching as he explained the evidence against Ambassador Dubois in both French and local languages. "My fellow Africans," Traore addressed his phone camera while Dubois stood stunned in the background. "For too long we have allowed foreign powers to steal our resources while hiding behind diplomatic immunity. Today we say enough. No one is above the law in Burkina Faso, regardless of their passport." The livestream exploded with supportive comments from across the African continent. The arrest proceedings continued as airport officials brought in additional security and began securing the crime scene. Dubois' phone was confiscated to prevent him from destroying evidence, and his diplomatic luggage was thoroughly searched, revealing additional incriminating documents that showed the smuggling operation extended to other African nations. French embassy officials arrived at the airport within 30 minutes, led by Deputy Ambassador Laurent, who immediately demanded Dubois' release. "President Traore, this is a catastrophic diplomatic error. Release Ambassador Dubois immediately, and France might consider this a misunderstanding. Continue this charade and you will face consequences you cannot imagine." But Traore had crossed the point of no return and showed no signs of backing down. "Deputy Ambassador Laurent, your colleague was caught stealing €2 million worth of our gold. If France considers enforcing our laws a diplomatic error, then perhaps it's time to reconsider our entire diplomatic relationship. His live stream, audience now numbering in the tens of thousands, cheered his response. The confrontation had escalated beyond a simple arrest into a fundamental challenge to the power dynamics that had governed Franco-African relations for decades. As international media began arriving at the airport and diplomatic cables flew between Ouagadougou and Paris, everyone realized they were witnessing a pivotal moment in African independence. Ambassador Dubois, now flanked by Burkinabe security, officers made one final plea. President Traore, you're starting something you cannot finish. France has ways of dealing with African leaders who forget their place. It was exactly the kind of threat that had kept African nations in line for generations, but Traore's response would define whether that era was finally ending. President Traore's eyes blazed with determination as he heard Ambassador Dubois' final threat about African leaders forgetting their place. The colonial arrogance in those words crystallized everything he had been fighting against since taking power. He stepped closer to the disgraced diplomat, his voice steady, but filled with the authority of a leader who would not be intimidated. Ambassador Dubois, the only place I've forgotten is the one your country assigned to mine. On our knees begging for scraps while you rob us blind. Traore replied, his words carrying across the airport and through his live stream to hundreds of thousands of viewers worldwide. Today, Burkina Faso remembers its rightful place as a sovereign nation that protects its own resources. The French Deputy Ambassador Laurent made one last desperate attempt to defuse the situation, pulling out his secure communication device to contact Paris directly. Mr. President, I have the Élysée Palace on the line. President Macron is personally requesting Ambassador Dubois' immediate release. Surely we can resolve this matter through proper diplomatic channels. But Traore had anticipated this pressure and prepared his response months in advance. Deputy Ambassador, tell President Macron that Burkina Faso operates under the rule of law, not the rule of France. Ambassador Dubois will face our justice system like any other criminal caught stealing our national resources. His live stream, audience exploded with supportive messages from across Africa and beyond. The seized gold bars were now displayed on a table surrounded by airport security, their official Burkinabe markings clearly visible to the cameras. Colonel Sawadogo had also discovered additional evidence in Dubois' personal effects, including encrypted communication devices and what appeared to be coordination instructions with French mining companies operating illegally in the region. As word of the arrest spread globally, African leaders began issuing statements of support for Traore's bold action. Presidents from Ghana, Mali, and Niger praised his courage in confronting Western exploitation, while European capitals scrambled to coordinate their response to this unprecedented challenge to diplomatic immunity. Dubois, realizing that his diplomatic protections had failed him completely, began negotiating for himself. President Traore, I can provide information about other operations, other officials involved in similar activities. This network extends far beyond Burkina Faso. Surely that's worth something to you. His willingness to betray his own government showed how completely his situation had deteriorated. The offer of cooperation momentarily intrigued Traore, who understood that Dubois might hold keys to exposing corruption throughout Francophone Africa. Ambassador, your cooperation will be noted by our courts, but it won't change the fact that you're going to face justice for your crimes against our people. Justice delayed is justice denied, and my people have waited too long already. Airport security had cordoned off the entire departure area as international media crews arrived to cover the historic arrest. Camera crews from BBC, Al Jazeera, and major African news networks set up equipment while journalists tried to get closer to the action. The story was becoming global news in real time, with social media amplifying every moment of the confrontation. The French security personnel who had accompanied Dubois were also detained for questioning, their diplomatic status not protecting them from investigation as potential accomplices in the smuggling operation. Their shocked expressions suggested they hadn't been fully aware of their ambassador's criminal activities, but Traore's security team, found encrypted communications on their devices that warranted further investigation. As the formal arrest procedures continued, Traore received urgent calls from his cabinet ministers, military commanders, and intelligence chiefs. Everyone understood that France would likely respond with economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or worse. But the young president had built his political career on the promise that Burkina Faso would never again bow to foreign pressure, regardless of the cost. Colonel Sawadogo, Traore ordered, ensure that Ambassador Dubois is treated with the dignity his office deserves, but make no mistake, he is under arrest and will be processed through our legal system like any other suspect. The colonel nodded and began coordinating with airport security to transport the diplomat to a secure detention facility. The crowd of Burkinabe citizens who had gathered at the airport began chanting Traore's name and singing traditional songs of victory. For many, this moment represented the fulfillment of promises made during independence movements decades earlier, promises that their resources would serve their people rather than foreign powers. French Deputy Ambassador Laurent made one final plea, his voice desperate as he realized the situation had spiraled completely beyond diplomatic control. President Traore, you're declaring war on France. This will destroy your economy, isolate your government, and potentially destabilize your entire region. Is your pride worth that price? Traore paused his live stream and looked directly at Laurent, his response destined to be remembered in history, books across Africa and beyond. The weight of his words would define not just Burkina Faso's future, but potentially inspire a new wave of African independence movements. President Traore looked directly into Deputy Ambassador Laurent's eyes, his response carrying the weight of centuries of colonial oppression and the hope of future African independence. Deputy Ambassador, you ask if my pride is worth the price of standing up to France. But you should be asking whether France's pride is worth losing Africa forever. He turned back to his live stream, now reaching over 1 million viewers across 6 continents. This isn't about pride. This is about justice. For 60 years, France has used diplomatic immunity as a shield to rob African nations blind. Today, that shield is broken. Today, Africa says we will no longer be silent partners in our own exploitation. The airport erupted in thunderous applause, as Burkinabe citizens realized they were witnessing their president make history. Ambassador Dubois was formally escorted away by security officers, his diplomatic immunity worthless in the face of overwhelming evidence, and a leader who refused to blink. The French diplomat's arrest photos would soon appear on front pages across the world, symbolizing a seismic shift in international relations. Within hours of the arrest, African leaders began following Traore's example. The president of Mali announced investigations into French mining operations in his country, while Ghana's president ordered audits of all diplomatic shipments leaving the nation. The domino effect that France had feared for decades was finally beginning, triggered by one young leader's refusal to accept the status quo. French President Macron's emergency response came swiftly, but proved counterproductive. Economic sanctions against Burkina Faso only strengthened African unity, as neighboring nations increased trade to compensate for French restrictions. Military threats backfired spectacularly when other African leaders pledged mutual defense support, making any French intervention politically impossible. The seized gold was publicly returned to Burkina Faso's national treasury in a ceremony that drew thousands of celebrating citizens. Traore used the moment to announce new policies ensuring that all mining revenues would directly fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure for his people, rather than flowing to foreign accounts through corrupt deals with diplomatic criminals. Ambassador Dubois' trial became an international sensation, with evidence presented showing a smuggling network that had stolen millions of dollars worth of resources from multiple African nations over decades. His cooperation with investigators led to arrests of French mining executives and the exposure of bank accounts used to launder stolen African wealth through European financial systems. The investigation revealed documents proving that French diplomatic pouches had been used to smuggle not just gold, but diamonds, rare earth minerals, and other valuable resources across Africa. The systematic nature of the theft shocked even Traore, who realized he had uncovered just the tip of an enormous criminal enterprise operating under diplomatic cover. International support for Traore's actions came from unexpected quarters. The United Nations issued statements supporting sovereign nations' rights to investigate diplomatic crimes, while the International Criminal Court opened preliminary investigations into the broader smuggling network. Even some European nations distanced themselves from France's colonial policies in Africa. The economic impact on France proved severe as African nations began renegotiating mining contracts, demanding fair prices for their resources and transparency in all transactions. French companies lost billions in projected profits as African governments implemented new oversight mechanisms to prevent future diplomatic theft. Traore's popularity soared not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa, where he became known as the president who finally stood up to European exploitation. Young Africans celebrated him on social media, calling him the leader who refused to blink when faced with centuries of colonial intimidation tactics. The diplomatic crisis forced France to fundamentally reconsider its relationship with Africa. New protocols were established requiring transparency in all diplomatic shipments, and several French ambassadors were quietly recalled as investigations spread across the continent. The era of unchecked colonial exploitation through diplomatic immunity was effectively ended. Ambassador Dubois received a prison sentence that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles worldwide. For the first time in modern history, a European diplomat faced real consequences for crimes against an African nation. His case became required study at diplomatic academies, serving as a warning that immunity had limits when it came to serious criminal activity. The gold that started the confrontation was melted down and made into commemorative coins, celebrating Burkina Faso's independence and sovereignty. Each coin bore Traore's image alongside the phrase "We will not blink" in local languages, becoming symbols of African resistance to foreign exploitation that were treasured across the continent. 5 years later, Traore's airport confrontation was recognized as the moment when Africa began truly asserting its independence from colonial economic control. The young president who refused to be intimidated by diplomatic threats had changed the course of history, proving that courage and principle could triumph over centuries of imperial domination. The legacy of that day lived on in every African child who grew up knowing that their resources belonged to their people, not to foreign diplomats with fancy immunity cards and colonial attitudes. Ibrahim Traore had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon against oppression is simply the courage to refuse to look away when confronted with injustice.